And on today's podcast, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Nigel Brayer. How are you today, Dr. Nigel?
I'm fantastic, David. Thanks for asking. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Nobody ever asked me that. You did. You're the first. Nobody cares about the host. Nobody cares. So my first question is to you, as I ask every guest, where are you right now on planet Earth?
I am in central United States in Ohio. It's 4 o'clock in a sunny afternoon.
In terms of sunny, make me jealous. I mean, in Ireland at the moment, it's kind of sunny, but it's really cold. So are we getting nice weather? Are we in between?
Yeah, it's 40 degrees, so what's that? 10 degrees Celsius or so, and partially sunny, cloudy. So in terms of February, it's a nice day.
Cool. And if you were to give a kind of like a travel advisory for anybody who wants to say as this is a career website as well, or podcast, if anybody was to move to your location or to travel there on holiday, what's the one thing you would say you need to come for?
I would say you want to get the pierogies um, in the old part of the city. Um, and you want to hit the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's right on Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes. So those are all exciting things to check out. And it's a great cost of living for somebody who wants to live here.
Oh, good. That's a wonderful review, especially for Irish people, because at the moment, all we can hear about is cost of living crisis. So we'll be all booking our tickets to Ohio very, very soon. So,
Yeah,
I gave a little introduction about your background at the beginning of the podcast. So, can you let the listeners know a little bit more about yourself?
sure. I've been a practicing chiropractor, functional medicine, and acupuncturist for the last, 28 years now. So I'm getting warmed up, I guess. I've had the opportunity to meet maybe thousands to hundreds of thousands of people over the years, and I guess it's just an exciting time to share health information because people are starting to look and ask questions and look for real answers to why problems come and why they don't resolve on their own and what they can do about it. So I'm excited to be able to give them at least some experience and a little bit insight.
When did all this kind of, would you say, would it be a passion? When did all this kind of start? Did you have this from a young age, or when you were in high school or college, or did it kind of transition into other areas?
Yeah, interesting question, David. Is I would say like most things is it wasn't on purpose. I was slated to go. I grew up in Western Canada in near the Rockies. I was slated to go to the University of British Columbia for med school back in the early 90s. Um, so I was all set up to, start med school. And I played hockey growing up and I had broken my leg. And since I had broken my leg, I started getting this chronic knee pain. And that knee pain kept really stopped me in my tracks for over 3 years. I just had severe knee pain that nobody could find the answer to. I went to all the doctors that were, of course, the ones who knew it all at that time, and nobody could figure out why I couldn't essentially walk. So I went from a really healthy late teenager to early 20s to really being disabled for almost 3 years. Um, so I was about to start medical school in British Columbia, and I was just in too much pain. I couldn't function. So one of my a family friend, or I don't recall who it was, had recommended that I see this doctor in this little bohunkety town that nobody's heard about as a possible answer to why I've had chronic knee pain. Prior to seeing this doctor, I went to oncologists. They thought I had cancer in my knee. They thought I had bone cancer. They did biopsies. They found nothing wrong. And then I went to this doctor. He took some x-rays. He was a chiropractor, nothing special, tiny little office. He took some x-rays and he looked at me, and within an hour, he figured out what was wrong with me. And within 3 weeks, 3 years of pain disappeared. Um, so what's interesting is it made me question everything to that point. I always wanted to be to help people. It's just my path took a different approach. And from that experience, it helped me understand is because you work in a big crystal palace with all these bells and whistles, doesn't mean that you have the answers. And so this doctor like I said, is he was a smart fella, but he was nothing pretentious. He figured out in a few minutes what others couldn't ever figure out, and he really changed my life. So that kind of directed me in a whole different pathway, and it kind of shook the foundations of my belief system. You know, in the past, I thought doctors had all the answers, and I realized that they don't have all the answers. They just have the answers that they look to question. And I noticed a lot of doctors don't ask questions; they just follow flow patterns of care. So I guess that was my impetus to start asking questions, and that led me along this path.
Did you find that, by asking these questions, it kind of gave you a little bit of resistance? That people were kind of challenging that, why is this guy, why is he constantly challenging or asking questions? When, like, the facts are the facts, the evidence is the evidence. You know what I'm trying to get at?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess I'll just go back to my personal experience is back with my chronic pain and what really stopped me from functioning altogether is everybody looked through their microscopic view, and from the microscopic view, everything was fine. But from the macroscopic view, everything wasn't fine. So I agree with you. The evidence is the evidence, but when you look at the evidence from different points of view, you see different things. And so if I'm looking at I'll use some words that people may not be familiar with, but histology, which means the cells. If I'm looking at a cell, all the cells might look fine when I'm looking through a microscope. But when I step way far back and I look at that whole system and how it works, it's not functioning. So my first experience is all of those doctors that I saw, they were giving me their best understanding, but their understanding was from a very small viewpoint. And I appreciated that doctor who helped me so much is because he had a bigger picture view, and it was very easy for him to see because his training was to look from a higher perspective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. No, 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 I understand. It's there's so many ways to skin a cat. It's kind of like, it's if any animal lovers out there, I do like animals. I don't recommend anybody skins a cat. It's just a term, it's just a phrase. Don't cancel me,
Yeah,
please.
yeah,
So no, I totally get that. Can I ask then, Doctor, just you said something there about your knee that, they thought you may have had cancer. As an example, that statement alone. Um, I had an experience many moons ago, and I had the same comment said to me because I was losing a lot of weight, but mine was based on a virus that I had picked up in a very tropical country, which had made me lose this weight. But the statement was used, you know, have you ever considered you might have cancer? Why would any professional say that without any background of knowing what the issue or the problem was?
sure. So I'll just speak personally again, is from mine, when I had broken my leg, I played hockey in college, I broke my leg, is my one leg growth plate was stunted because of the fracture. I ended up growing an inch between the ages of 19 and 21. My my fractured leg was stunted. It didn't grow the inch, my other one did. So my problem came from a fracture that stunted my growth plate, which caused my leg length to be very inappropriate. So because of that, it created enormous strain on the outside of my leg. And over time, just like a callus on your hand, is it would start to build up tissue. So
Right.
when they looked at the tissue, they said, oh, he's got building up tissue coming in the area of the bone. It must be a bony growth. Well, bony growths can often be cancer. So they kind of made a generalized statement. And of course, it was not cancer after the biopsy. But I guess it's assumptions when you don't know the answers, you look for the outliers. And of course, that was scary back in many years ago, but also it helped me evolve my understanding to say, hey, um, just because you don't have the answers, don't start throwing out words that can really dramatically affect somebody. Because even if yourself thinking laying awake at night thinking you have cancer, that causes enormous stress and strain. And I can't imagine you felt too good or you were pretty worried for some time.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's enormously disruptive to you and to your health in general. So
Yeah. And it was totally something non-related. It was a tropical, it was a tropical virus or infection I got, which was totally
sure,
unrelated. So I just thought, like, when any doctors or professionals, please, be aware that people are scared of the word, the C word, and
Yeah.
use it with caution. Please, please, please. Anyway, let's move on to the main kind of topic of our chat today. So, right, let's keep it as basic as possible. As if you're talking to me, who's an idiot. I'm not saying the listeners are idiots or stupid or whatsoever, but say it's me. What is the bladder?
So, like I like to share it this way is we have kidneys that are on the both sides of our back under our ribs, and we have two tubes coming out of our kidneys. Kidneys filter blood, they filter toxins, they filter out uric acid from metabolism of burning, our food and energy. And then it drains through the ureters into the bladder. So the bladder is like a balloon sitting right by your pubic bone. That's where obviously the urine is held. And then outside of the bladder is a tube. I think of it like a balloon with a straw in it. Is then the straw comes out what's called the urethra, and then you expel, go to the bathroom. Obviously, men's urethras are longer. What I want everyone to understand is men have two valves on that. So think of a balloon with a straw, and you have a valve right where the balloon meets the straw, and then you have a valve, which is called the sphincter, right where the balloon or the straw exits to the outside of our body. In men's cases, we have two. In women's cases, they more or less have one, and that's a big component as to why certain things are more prevalent in women and others are more prevalent in men.
So pretty much women got the short straw, if we say it that way.
Shorts, literally, yes.
The short
I never
straw.
thought of it that way, but they do have the
Yeah,
short
I'm
straw.
sorry for the bad joke. I do
Yeah.
apologize. So, okay, so we have this bladder, right? So, what what is kind of the main use of the bladder? Why? I know you mentioned like it kinds of kidneys and the straws kind of go down to the bladder, and then what is the main use?
So the bladder holds urine, and the urine is a byproduct of metabolism and water and toxins and all this other stuff the body doesn't need um, to be expelled.
So we probably hear this conversation a lot. I mean, has the bladder any association in relation to, say, color of urine?
Color of what? Sorry, I didn't hear
Urine
you.
itself, yeah, that we're
Oh,
expelling.
color. Sure. So, yeah, the color of the urine can be indication of, dehydration. It can be due to vitamin supplementation. It can change colors due to infection. So there's a lot of different factors that'll affect urine coloration. Um, but again, the darkness or the lightness has to do more with hydration. Other more obscure colors could have indications of on kidney health. If there's, let's say, actual red, then that's more indicative of blood, which, for the first thought of it would usually be infection somewhere along there. Usually things that are above the kidney wouldn't show up red. It'd be a different color, like black or brown. But so yeah, the urine color can have an indication. For most people, it's not that pertinent. Most people don't drink enough water, so they usually need more.
Right. And the problems with the bladder specifically, what are the general problems that the bladder can bring to an individual on a daily, weekly, monthly basis?
Sure. I would say probably the biggest issue with the bladder itself is going to be incontinence in usually ladies over 40, and all ladies, but in mostly ladies who've had children. And the second would be what's called cystitis, which would be a bladder infection. That's really common. Um, for various reasons, that's where you get a bacterial overgrowth, which will cause pain, like right above the pubic bone, which is right by your waistline, which could be pain during urination or burning, those type of things. So that'd be the most common bladder related issues that people would be at least familiar with to some degree.
Right. And can you kind of give a definition or another kind of a simple explanation of what incontinence is? Is it like no strength whatsoever in the bladder that it just comes out?
Yeah, so there's various degrees. On my website, it's called the Quid test. It's a test that people can take. There's simple questions. It just helps them identify whether they have incontinence or what type there is. There's two different types. There's one's called stress and one's called, excuse me, stress incontinence and urge incontinence. But a long story short is it's the inability to control the bladder when you want it to. So, for example, if you got to go to the bathroom and then you start thinking about it, and the next thing you go, you can't hold it or you start leaking, that's a certain type of incontinence where the bladder, the valve starts to, it's called fasciculate, which means it's almost like it pulses because it can't control that flow. Sometimes it's just not available at all. Certain diseases can create that or hormonal changes. And then it can also be that the bladder itself has pressure on it. So there's a condition that some ladies experience, which is called an anteverted uterus, which means the tissues in the pelvic region start to lose their elasticity. And all of those tissues put more pressure on the bladder. So the bladder itself may not be that weak, but the pressure on it has become greater. So again, there's various different things that'll influence that balloon as we talked about, and then how well that valve works or doesn't work. And that'll all be, show up in the ability to hold the bladder.
Right, I mean, a great way of explaining it. And you mentioned there, like, say if an individual is kind of thinking about relieving themselves, and the kind of stress is there and they can't hold it anymore. Is that the brain connected to that kind of decision making, or is it something kind of related to the bladder itself that's not strong enough, or is it anxiety, or is there a multitude of things?
Yeah, and that's an awesome question because interestingly enough, that question is what kind of led me to what I call the ironclad bladder system. Is common knowledge of the past was it was all based upon the valve and the strength of the valve. So I think of it this way, it's like your biceps, your arm muscle. I can't hold a 5 pound weight, therefore I need to exercise it so I can hold 5 pounds or 10 pounds. So the common thinking with treatment of incontinence right now, or in the past anyway, was the valve isn't strong enough. We've got to do something called Kegel exercises, which just simply means imagine going to the bathroom and then stopping, going to the bathroom and stopping. What you're doing is you're consciously controlling that valve, and that's called a Kegel exercise. But what's interesting, and this is also what I found in my practice, is that only helps a small number of people.
Okay.
And so through research over the years and through practice, I realized that that's not really addressing the main cause. And this goes back to your earlier question. Is it the mind or is it the body? And the answer is it's both. And it's mostly the mind. And so when I say the mind, it's not so much that you got to think your way out of it, but it's these unconscious autonomic patterns. So I like to share it with this way with people is, you can move your arm to your mouth. That's what's called a voluntary contraction. Your brain is sending impulses to the muscle and your muscle is moving. Now, your heart's beating, but you're not telling it to beat. What's making it beat? Or if you get excited, your heart rate's going to go up. What's making it go up? You're not thinking about it happening, it's happening automatically. That's called the autonomic nervous system. And so, through my studies, just as I developed this program to help patients, and most importantly, my wife, was I come to realize through research that over 70% of that valve is what's called autonomically controlled. So that begs the question of saying, okay, you have 70% of the valve that's controlled by the same thing that beats your heart. Now, if you go into deep meditation and work on this for, months or years, you can learn to consciously control your heart by affecting your autonomic nervous system. You can do that, David, if you really wanted to, right? Well, what's happening with the bladder is your bladder and your control of the bladder has more to do with these autonomically controlled patterns that you've developed over decades than it does with your current strength that you have of your sphincter right now. So, in layman term, what does that mean? It means that I found my best success in incorporating the physical components to help the bladder and what's called the perineum, which is all that tissue underneath the bottom of your groin. But the biggest impact we had was by addressing the autonomic nervous system by retraining what's called the vagus nerve. And so, what that means is by retraining what's called the vagal tone, which is just a $50 word for by retraining that autonomic nervous system to not be so reactive, that's where we got the biggest effect um, on resolving urinary incontinence.
Wow, that's
It's pretty
fascinating. That
cool.
is.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, it is fascinating to think that the brain is so powerful. Um, and you can kind of train yourself in and out of certain kind of issues or problems. But for the men, if there's any men listeners there, we're not leaving you out, men. We know you have two straws and women just have the one. But um, how, I mean, what's the situation with the men specifically? I mean, do they have similar kind of issues as they approach over 40, or is it later on in life?
Sure. So everybody, male and females, have their different, shall I say, challenged areas. When it comes to urinary incontinence, the research says that the men with urinary incontinence tend to seek out options sooner than women. And I'm not sure of all the reasons, but first of all, is there usually when they hit the ages of between 40 and 60, they start looking at prostate health.
Right.
And because of the location of the prostate, so let's go back to the straw, for example. So you've got the urethra coming out of the bladder, and males about, I'll say, a centimeter or so where the straw meets the bladder, you have the prostate gland. And that prostate gland is going to affect that straw. So if that becomes swollen for various reasons, then what happens is it starts to create pressure on that straw. So men usually have an issue with inability to urinate because of enlarged prostate, where women usually have issues with, being able to control the urination. But a long story short is because men start thinking prostate health earlier, they'll usually have underlying issues related to that kind of addressed sooner.
Right.
So it tends to be less prevalent in men than in women. Plus, just from an anatomical standpoint, is the men don't have the uterus that sits right essentially on top of the bladder. And then men also don't have children, which obviously affects the integrity of all those tissues in that area. And then you've got also estrogen and progesterone, which is another big factor with the integrity of the tissue.
And could there be confusion between, say, a bladder issue in a man and the prostate? I mean, and when should there be concern? I mean, how long, actually, in general, how long should you leave a bladder infection? I mean, if you have a bit of a pain down there, do you need to get it sorted out as soon as possible?
Yeah, when it comes to infection, those things are super easy to diagnose. What I encourage people to do is just from a natural standpoint, is so if I had a patient who has a concern of a bladder infection, I tell them two things: is go online and buy what's called D-mannose. It's a sugar. It doesn't have calories. It doesn't give you energy. It's an non-absorbable sugar, and what it does is it coats the bladder. And what the coating of the bladder does is it prevents bacteria from attaching. So I encourage them to start taking a quarter teaspoon of D-mannose every day or even twice a day. And then I have them start taking cranberry capsules, 3 to 4 times a day. So you're doing two things: is you're coating the bladder with a sugar that bacteria can't, that prevents them from attaching, and then you're acidifying the bladder because most bacteria are sensitive to pH changes, which is acidity. The cranberry helps acidify the bladder, and if you do have a low-grade infection, most of the time it's going to resolve on its own. If after 4 to 5 days it doesn't resolve on its own, or there's no discomfort, there's no pain urinating, if you ever see blood that's like redness, you definitely want to have that checked right away. You don't want to wait and do this protocol or what I just mentioned. Um, if that doesn't resolve, then the next simple test is you go to your doctor of any sort and do a urinalysis. They do a quick test to see what the bacteria count is, and then treat it accordingly.
Is there, I mean, is there different kind of signs and symptoms between what a man and a woman might experience in terms of having problems with the bladder, other than kind of, as we mentioned, maybe incontinence or so on? Is there any other kind of signs and symptoms?
Um, Not really. It's called suprapubic pain, which means you have the pubic bone, which everyone can feel right below their waistline, just above their genitals. Is pain above the pubic bone when you push, that's pretty much right where the bladder is. That shouldn't be painful. Now, painful like you have a sore muscle, that's not what I mean, but painful like you feel like a searing pain, or if you have pain or dramatic urgency. So, like infections in general will increase urgency. Like, gosh, seem to have to go to the bathroom all the time. So, those are always those are common in male or females. Um, And one of the big things that you always want to recommend or notice is if there's ever a fever involved, the big issue with a bladder infection or something that affects the bladder is you don't want it to work its way up. Because remember, bacteria don't follow rules, they just grow. And so they would start growing essentially up the ureter and could get into the kidney. And kidneys infections can be very dangerous. So, of course, if you start having a fever or you get more and more blood, that's usually going to tell us that it's migrating. And that's something you want to address usually with some sort of antibiotic
Right.
as soon as possible. Yeah.
And can that lead, like, is it mentioned there, like migrating, like sepsis or something like that? Could it get to the stage of sepsis or?
Yeah, so sepsis usually means that it's went outside of the organ itself and started to get into the bloodstream. So when a bacteria goes in the bloodstream, could be life-threatening, obviously. That means that it's traveling. Now, for a bladder infection to turn into a kidney infection that causes sepsis, that would have to take quite a bit of time. So I think a person would be extremely uncomfortable well before it ever got to that place.
Right.
Therefore, they'd probably have taken action already. But not saying it's
So,
not possible. It's just not
yeah.
that likely.
The embarrassing side of this, I mean, as a doctor, what would you tell your clients, your patients? I mean, is it just a case of, look, this is kind of normal. We're going to try and get this resolved. We'll try and make it a better situation, strengthen the bladder. I mean, what do you say to somebody that's kind of embarrassed?
Well, I'd like to go back a little bit historically to just the stats. Is if you look up, urinary incontinence in women, over the age of 40, we're talking 70 to 80% of women experience it. But what I find interesting, and I've been in patient care for a long time, is we all think that we're alone and we're the only ones. And that's just, I guess, kind of like human nature. But the key becomes is you're not alone. But secondly, is a lot of our angst comes from past. And I had this conversation with another person a while back. Is she asked me, she goes, well, why are people so afraid to talk about it? And we went to the topic of, well, what's one of our very first milestones as a child, David? If you think about it, and you probably don't even remember it, what was the one of the very first accomplishments that you ever had as a human being? And that is you were
Take my
potty
nappy
trained.
off. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And
Yeah.
so that was kind of the impetus for all of this. I am becoming a young independent person. So I've kind of racked my brain over it. It's like, why is it such a stigma? Why is it such a problem? And all I've come to reason with is deep down in our subconscious mind, we have our value of an individual as, or at least a piece of it, as my ability to hold my urine and bladder. And it started back when you were what, 2, 3, 4 years old, whatever it might have been. And so I have a feeling is when we lose that is people start to have really big self-worth issues.
Right.
And that self-worth, it kind of conjures up a lot of things that they don't even understand. But the instinct is, I don't want to share it because I'm going to be judged. I don't want to share it is because someone's going to criticize me, or I'm not going to share it because someone's going to think less of me. But I guess the answer to your question in a roundabout way is it's extremely common and true natural healthy solutions are not that far away. But unfortunately, we have to kind of face our fear to get past just going with the flow and buying another set of, pads or adult diapers.
Right. I mean, we mentioned there, like, generally it's us old folks that have these problems, but for the younger folks, we'll say, I mean, are the symptoms kind of similar in them, say younger kids or even teenagers and so on, that maybe a young girl who obviously hasn't had children, or a younger guy, is it quite similar?
Yeah, it's much less common in young people. We see it a lot more with athletes, and we see it more often in female athletes. And the same premise applies. With younger athletes, it has a lot to do with, we talked about, remember, stress incontinence and urge incontinence. So stress has to do with mostly muscular and functional, they'll say. How's everything down there working? Urge incontinence has more to do with how is the nervous system working. Now, of course, we break it up so you and I can talk about it easier, but nothing is just black and white. But in the younger population, it has more to do with the mechanics and the stressors that go on in that region. And in the older population, it has to do with the mechanics, the changes in the tissue, and most importantly, and really the answer to the problem is the nervous system and how it functions.
Right.
So the answer is yes. It's just a little different pathway because younger folks, their tissues are a lot more robust and elastic. It usually has to do with the function.
And there's no possibility or there's no information out there that people that are throwing like a kettlebell in the air or they're kind of doing some strenuous squats, or is there anything to say that that might cause maybe issues with the bladder or any other part of the system?
Well, again, as those are physical stressors. So as you increase the stressors, the capacity of the bladder to, and most importantly, the sphincters to hold that bladder should be there. So if a person's doing those activities and it can't, that's usually an indication that something is functionally not as efficient as it could be. Because let's be honest, you and I should be able to lift kettlebells and we should be able to squat. Now, there's exceptions. Lifting a small car is different than lifting a 20-pound kettlebell.
Yeah.
So there's exceptions to these generalizations, but our bladder should be able to hold its integrity and hold its urine back under almost every circumstance,
Right.
unless something's keeping it from doing what it should.
So let's hope with then the positive sides of what you do with the ironclad bladder system. So if I'm going to you now as an example, and I say, look, I'm having these issues, I'm having these problems. What is your system? So are we talking about, is there certain diets as well? Is there certain supplementation and so on? So go ahead, sell it, Dr. Nigel.
So what's exciting about it is there's no cell, there's just facts. So what I usually do first is we do what's called the QUID test, and this is on my website. Everyone can take it. It's free, it's easy. It just helps us understand, hey, is there an incontinence issue? Yes or no? If there is it more stress related, meaning the function of the muscle, the tissue, the bladder itself, or is it more related to the nervous system? And like we'd said before, it's usually both. So based upon that test, we give it a score, and that score helps us break it into three categories: mild, moderate, or advanced or severe. And then based upon there, what we do is we work on first is reconnecting the nervous system component. So we talked earlier about that valve, ladies' valves, men's too, but ladies in particular, 70% of that valve is unconsciously controlled. So then our system is going to be how do we reset that neural pathway? So nerves are just like wires. So the more a nerve is used, the we won't say thicker, but I'll use that word for simplicity, the more prominent that nerve function is. So a good example is if you exercise your muscle, every day, that nerve pathway is going to be more dominant than if you don't or use another muscle rarely. Well, the bladder is no different. If a neural pathway isn't used much, it pretty much withers away. And if a neural pathway is used a lot, that one becomes more dominant. So the question becomes is how do you reset neural pathways that have been developed over lifetime? And that's where what we use is what's called biofeedback, which helps you start to retrain the mind-body connection. But that's also where we use specific acupuncture points. If a person was seeing me in my clinic, we would actually do the acupuncture points with needles. But what I found is if we do the same thing using not needles, just stimulating those points at home, we have very similar outcomes, similar results. So we work on three things. Is first to start rebalancing the neural pathways, the unconscious nervous system via what's called the vagus nerve. So I'm trying to keep people from going deep into the weeds of neuroscience here. But you've got the sympathetic nervous system, that's called the fight flight system. And then you've got the parasympathetic, which is the heal and restore system. Most people in first world nations, well, I could probably say most people across the world are what's called sympathetic dominant. So that means our body's in a constant fight or flight state for decades. That's why most of our diseases are based upon that. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, those are all what are called sympathetic based diseases. So, what we do is we start reducing the sympathetic connection and start augmenting what's called the parasympathetic via what's called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve helps things to relax. It reduces strain, it reduces blood pressure, it reduces tension, not only on your heart and your blood vessels, which you can imagine the importance of that, but also of the bladder, the perineum. So remember, we talked about the tone. If your fist is clenched 24/7, 7 days a week, and then you want to clench it harder, well, that's very difficult, right?
Yeah.
Because just think of the energy it takes. That's where what's called fasciculations occur, where now you don't have the strength because you're in this constant rigor state. Well, by resetting that and helping to relax, which seems contradictory, right? People would think, well, I need to be tighter to reduce urine flow. But one of the big problems is we're too tight already because our whole life is wrapped up like a spring because we're so sympathetically dominant that our bladder is just another outcome of that. And our inability to hold it is because it's already wound so tight that it can't hold itself any tighter. So it starts to leak, it starts to spasm, it starts to let go. So again, back to the topic at hand is retrain that nervous system, start reducing the sympathetic dominance, restoring or improving the vagal nerve function so that things relax. The second thing that we work on is what's called mindfulness. Is most of us are busily thinking about the future or busily thinking about the past. We're rarely in this moment. So when we think about the future, we're usually setting up scenarios in our mind, and then we're creating a scenario and we're reacting to that scenario, and then physically our body's responding to that scenario, right? So the goal is if we can get the mind, the nervous system, and the anatomy all working together, then the anatomy is going to function better, which obviously helps people, resolve incontinence. But from a big picture health standpoint, you've now improved heart health, you've improved digestive health, you've improved your relationships, you've improved your reactiveness to other people. You see how they're all connected.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
No, it's brilliant. And what about success stories?
So interestingly enough, my first patient was, and again, as most things happen by accident, um, my first patient was my wife. Um, she really stopped interacting with a lot of our family activities. We've always been an active family. We ski, we mountain bike, we do all sorts of things. And she just kind of stopped partaking and she never really told me why. And then after some probing, it was probably 6 or 8 months into it because she really reduced the amount of activity she was doing. I thought, well, maybe she's tired or whatever it might be. And then she, under kind of embarrassment, she said, well, when I do these things, I leak. I mean, I asked, well, what do you mean you leak? She goes, well, I can't hold my bladder. I pee my pants. I'm
Wow.
like, wow, you're kidding me. She goes, no. And I'm like, well, you do know what I do, don't you? And she goes, well, yeah. She goes, but I didn't want to tell you. And I asked her, I said, well, why? And she really didn't have the answer, but she just said that she was extremely embarrassed. So, like most people, she just reduced what she was doing, which was kind of sad because she went from being super active and all these things that she enjoyed to really putting those on the back burner to prevent leakage.
Right.
And I thought to myself, well, this was my wife, and I've known her for years, and she knows what I do, and she still didn't feel comfortable sharing it with me. She did eventually, but imagine the average person out there whose husband isn't a doctor or has all these other issues that she doesn't want to share. She's not going to share it, right? So then I started doing some research in my practice and I pulled out a bunch of files from patients in a certain age group and I started kind of reviewing through the files. And I noticed most of the women that those files I reviewed, ladies over 40 who've had children, they all checked off incontinence in what's called a review of systems on their chart. Now, it was there when I first saw them, but it was something I didn't really give much notice. So these same group of women, I when they came back in for whatever issues they were coming in for, I brought up the incontinence issue, and years after they come in, they'd still had it. So that's where I started working on a protocol to help, solve that. So my wife was part of this initial group. This was some years ago. And then I started doing the three-phase treatments in my office. And then I realized that most women are never going to get the solutions they're looking for. So I really wanted to take what I had learned over those years and put it in a format that first doesn't involve you having to talk to your doctor, which obviously can be a barrier for various reasons to people, but that they can take the best of what I've learned over the years and start to implement it at home
Right.
and get the results that they're looking for there. Yeah,
And did your wife, as an example, I'm sorry for your wife that we're talking about you on the podcast, but for your wife or your patients or clients, I mean, did you notice or did they notice specifically to you a gradual improvement over the periods of time? And did they kind of say, wow, okay. And did their confidence grow?
sure. So a couple things happened, which was pretty cool, is 95% of the women had full resolution via our protocol. Everyone had improvement. The only one who didn't have full resolution was somebody who had incontinence as a result of cancer. She had pelvic cancer, which they removed her bladder, they removed her uterus, they removed pretty much everything. Um, but she had so much scar tissue in that area. She had about 70% improvement, and we used our scoring system as that measurement. But the results were unheard of. So if you do any research on incontinence, even the best treatment, which is very invasive, um, only says around 40 to 50% improvement. So the fact that we were getting 80 to 90% without any drugs, without any medication, without any invasive procedures, I was extremely pleased, which is pretty exciting.
No, that's brilliant. I mean, for somebody to get a bladder removed, what happens after that? I mean, do they get is something else inserted in place, or how does that work?
Sure. So again, cancer follows some rules, bacteria follow none. So what happens with cancer is as it grows, it takes up space, and then if it gets in the blood system, it's called metastasis, and then it spreads all over the place. But what happens is it can metastasize into other areas, which means I think of it like, seeds being spread. If those cancer cells get spread into other areas, those areas are compromised. And in her case, part of her bladder, not her entire bladder, but part of her bladder had metastatic disease. So she had a resection, which means they had to remove approximately half of her bladder. She still had some. If she had none at all, obviously we wouldn't have worried about treating her at all because she would have worn a bag
Right.
to hold her urine. But in her case, she had lost around, I think, 30% or so. So she still had integrity in some function of the bladder, and that's why she was able to improve. But yes, is if those organ systems are totally inundated with cancer, then the typical protocol is to remove it. And in that case, they removed her uterus, her ovaries, a portion of her bladder, and then they did radiation and other things for the bones of her pelvis. So it was pretty intense. A lot of scarring, a lot of damage, but you know,
Geez, I mean,
it,
I mean, in some ways you have to say, thank you for technology and for all this information. I mean, as the years go on, these wonderful treatments and like yourself coming out here or chatting to me today. I'm on your website. I'm being very nosy, drnigelbrayer.com, and you have the Natural Bladder Doctor. You have a shop, you have testimonials, you have some freebies and a recommended list. So, um, when relation to the free books, I mean, what are they? How helpful are they, and what do they involve?
so I didn't catch that first part of the question, David. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're grand. I think I'm breaking up the signals a little bit. So, just generally, I'm on your website here. You have some very nice freebies. So, you have the 5 hacks for bladder health. You have a cookbook, and you have workouts. So, what do those books actually involve?
Sure. So those are some simple first steps that people can take right away just to help improve the function of the bladder. Also, food is a big component. And I encourage people to notice if there's anyone experiencing incontinence, and even folks who aren't, is start noticing how what you eat affects your bladder. So I've noticed that coffee, and I'll speak personally, is certain coffees are going to cause bladder spasm. Um, Inorganic or non-organic coffee, I've observed affects people's bladder more than organic coffee. We've found that teas also have that effect. So T has to do with tannins. So what tannins are from skins and bark of any sort of living, growing plant. And if we drink those tannins, what they do is they break down mucus linings. And so remember, your bladder has a lining, just like your ureters, your blood vessels, your stomach. And so certain things will cause irritations to linings. And whenever there's an irritation, you're going to have an effect on it. So really what we do in our cookbooks and some of our free hacks is I want people to start thinking about how what they're eating affects their bladder. And then also some of the motions that I share there is integrity of anything has to do with the integrity of the whole system. So if a person, let's say, is overweight, that's going to influence the bladder, right? There's more mass on there, that's going to affect you. So as you increase general muscle tone, those are some very first, easy first steps people can start to take to improve that function is what they eat and just their general movement.
Brilliant. And for anybody wanting to kind of sign up to the Ironclad Bladder system, is is that like global in terms of can they do it via your website? Can they do it on Zoom? Is it face to face? How does that work?
Sure. So on my website, drnigelbrayer.com, is we're going to be having a free mini course coming up in middle of April. There's a sign up sheet, I believe, on my website. That's going to be like a free seminar. We're going to talk about the ironclad bladder. We're going to talk about hormones. We're going to talk about stress, just several things that people can do at home right away. And then that'll lead up to what's called our 30-day program. That's going to start in May. At that time, what we'll do is we're going to take a group of ladies through the protocol of the ironclad bladder, but we're also going to take them into a deeper dive of, and I know we didn't get into this much, David, but the bladder is just a system amongst a whole bunch of systems. And there's a saying I like to bring up to people, which makes a lot of sense, is what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right?
Yep.
So if you want a healthier bladder, the first step is to start gaining bladder control. And that's what the ironclad bladder system's for, is to gain bladder control. But symptoms are usually an outcome of a much deeper things that have built up. And I just don't feel like if I help people just with the bladder, it's important, but if I don't help them with the other components that are building up behind it, then I really haven't done everything I can to help person get healthier. And that's what the 30-day program is about is how do we look at nutrition? How do we look at our GI function? How do we look at hormones? How does that affect our bladder? How does that affect our stress? How do we manage stress? So the goal is to help people say, okay, let's get this bladder under control. That's important. But then how do I get my whole health in order? Because let's be honest, is all of us are aging, me and you included. If we take some small steps now, we can circumvent enormous amounts of bigger problems later. And that's really the goal of that program is to help lead people step by step on easy ways to circumvent so many of the problems that, we're all going to face as we age.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, it's fascinating insight today, the bladder and beyond. And so before we go, I mean, are you on all the LinkedIns and the Facebooks and the Instagrams and the TikToks?
I believe we are. So yeah, check us out. If there's any questions too, as I answer all my emails myself, they can connect with me via my website. And yeah, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to share.
No, thanks so much to Dr. Nigel Brayer today for joining the Wellbeing Group podcast. I'll put all the links. You can get in touch with Dr. Nigel once the podcast has been approved and released. So thanks so much to Dr. Nigel today.
Thanks, David.